He rejected his mate, so she married a quiet stranger. Biggest mistake of his life. Paranormal romance story. It was not a quiet night. The fire in the center of the Ironwood Pack courtyard burned the way it always did during a binding ceremony, tall, orange, and merciless, throwing sharp shadows across every face gathered in the yard. The whole pack was there, elders in their ceremonial furs, young wolves who had never witnessed a rejection standing on their toes to see, children who did not understand what was happening but felt, in the tightening of the air, that something important was being broken tonight. Vivian stood in the middle of all of it. She was not adorned. She had not come dressed for a celebration. She wore a simple dark cloak over a fitted brown traveling dress, and her dark hair, long, wind-touched, slightly tangled from the walk across the pack grounds, fell loose around her face. Her hands were steady at her sides. Her jaw was set. Her eyes, deep brown and unusually still for a woman standing at the center of her own humiliation, were fixed on one person. Andrew. He stood across the fire from her, and he was not looking at her. That was the first thing she noticed. After everything, after the years, after the bond that had existed between them since they were teenagers, fumbling through the early recognition of a fated connection, Andrew could not find it in himself to look her in the eye on the night he destroyed her. He was tall, sharp-featured in the way that powerful men sometimes are, like time had carved his face out of something deliberately hard. He wore a dark fur-lined coat, the collar turned up against the cold, and his posture was rigid, the practiced stillness of a man performing authority for an audience. His hands were clasped behind his back. His silver-gray eyes were fixed on a point somewhere above her head. On his left stood Precious. If Vivian was the winter forest, dark, deep, unadorned, then Precious was the chandelier in the room nobody lived in. She wore ivory silk that caught the firelight and returned it as gold. Jewels at her throat. Her dark hair was coiled and pinned. Her posture was composed in the way of a woman who had rehearsed this exact moment 100 times. And she was smiling, not widely, not cruelly, just enough to make her satisfaction impossible to miss. Vivian noticed all of it. She noticed the way Precious stood half a step closer to Andrew than she needed to. She noticed the slight lift of Andrew's chin, the performance of certainty from a man who had spent 6 months being certain. She noticed the faces of the pack around her, the elders who wouldn't meet her gaze, the women her age who were watching with something between pity and relief that it wasn't them, the younger wolves who didn't understand yet what rejection meant, that it wasn't just a word, that it was surgical, that it removed something living. The alpha elder raised his hand, and the crowd settled into silence. Andrew finally spoke. "I have chosen my path." His voice was steady, controlled. It carried across the yard the way trained voices do, clear, authoritative, stripped of feeling. "Vivian, you are my fated mate, and I choose to reject that bond. I choose it willingly, with full awareness of what I am doing. I choose the future of this pack over the arrangement of fate. I choose strength over sentiment." He paused. The fire cracked. Somewhere in the crowd, a child started to cry and was quickly hushed. "I reject you." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They landed inside Vivian's chest like a key turning in a lock, and then the lock broke, and everything it had been holding collapsed inward all at once. The bond. The warmth she had carried in the back of her ribs for years without even naming it. The quiet certainty that had always existed beneath the surface of her days. The one that whispered, "You are not alone. There is someone in the world whose soul knows yours." Gone. Not faded. Not dimmed. Gone. Her wolf made a sound inside her that she had never heard before. Not a howl. Not a growl. Something smaller, and infinitely worse, the sound of an animal that had just understood a loss it had no words for. Vivian did not cry. Not there. Not in that yard, with those eyes on her, with Precious standing in ivory silk, with Andrew's jaw set and his gaze still not quite meeting hers. She breathed in through her nose, slow and deliberate. She felt the hollow where the bond had been enormous, aching, impossible to ignore. She acknowledged it the way a person acknowledges a wound in the field. Yes, this is here, yes, this will require attention, but not now. Not here. She held her chin level. She turned, and she walked. No pack, no mate, no safety. Just the cold ground beneath her boots, the firelight shrinking at her back, and the long, silent walk toward a world that had not asked for her and did not know she was coming. Andrew didn't call her back. That was his first mistake. It would not be his last. A moment with you. Hey, quick question. How are you feeling right now? Because if that opening already has your heart doing something complicated, good. That means you're paying attention. Thank you so much for being here. It really means the world to me. If this story is already pulling at something in you, please take 1 second to hit the subscribe button, smash the like, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It helps more than you know. Every comment, every subscription, it tells me you're here, that this story matters, and it keeps stories like Vivian's alive. So go ahead, subscribe, like, comment your location. I'll be waiting to say hello to you personally. Alright, thank you. Now let's get back to Vivian. The pack house was behind her now. Vivian walked the eastern trail, the one that wound through the pine ridge and came out at the edge of Ironwood territory where the pack markers gave way to neutral ground. She had walked this trail 100 times growing up. She had run it as a wolf, leaping roots, weaving between trees, feeling the pack bond hum pleasantly in the back of her consciousness like a held note. Now the trail felt different. The trees were the same. The cold was the same early autumn biting through the gaps in her cloak. But the hum was gone. She stopped at the ridge, where the pine trees thinned and the territory marker, a carved stone post wrapped in a binding cord, stood at the edge of the path. She had been told, in the months leading up to the ceremony, what a rejection crossing felt like. Other rejected females had described it to her once, at a gathering, in hushed voices like it was something shameful. They had not prepared her adequately. When her boot crossed the invisible line of the boundary, the severance hit her like cold water entering her lungs. The ambient presence of her packmates, the low, constant background hum of 300 connected souls, the thing she had lived inside her entire life without ever consciously noticing it vanished. In the space of 1 step, Vivian went down on 1 knee in the dirt. Her hands found the ground. She gripped the cold earth and breathed through the wave of vertigo, the sudden and absolute silence of a mind that had never been this alone. No pack warmth, no shared emotional current, no distant sense of Andrew, which had always existed somewhere far in her peripheral awareness the way a lighthouse exists even when you're not looking at it. Nothing. She stayed on her knee for 2 full minutes. She counted her breaths. She let the silence be what it was. Then she stood up. She adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder and she kept walking. There is something that experienced counselors who work with rejected wolves know, and which most packs fail to teach their young. The severance of a mate bond is a legitimate grief. It is not a weakness. It is not a dramatic overreaction. The bond between fated mates is neurological, hormonal, deeply embedded in the wolf biology. Breaking it is genuinely traumatic in the physiological sense. The body experiences it as a loss, and it must be processed as one. Vivian did not know this formally, but her body was going to teach it to her over the coming weeks whether she wanted the lesson or not. That first night, she walked until her legs told her they were done. She found a hollow beneath a fallen oak, wide enough to crawl into, sheltered from the worst of the wind. She shifted. The wolf form was warmer, and grief was easier to carry on 4 legs for reasons she couldn't fully articulate, and she curled into herself in the dark. Her wolf didn't howl. That was the thing that frightened her most. The silence in her wolf was heavier than any sound. She thought about Andrew. Not with anger. Not yet. Anger would come later and it would be bright and useful. That first night, she thought about him the way you think about something you've lost. Involuntarily, the mind returning to the gap the way a tongue returns to a missing tooth. She thought about the version of him she had known at 19, when he'd first acknowledged the bond between them and looked at her with something undisguised on his face. She thought about when that version of him had started to leave. It had been gradual. So gradual she had explained it away at every stage. The increasing coldness. The way pack politics had begun to occupy more of his thinking than she did. The night 8 months ago, when he had come home from a meeting with the neighboring Crestfall pack and looked at her differently, not with cruelty, but with a kind of careful calculation, the look of a man who was beginning to run numbers in his head. She had told herself she was imagining it. She had not been imagining it. Lesson 1, Vivian learned that night in the hollow. The heart will believe what it needs to believe for as long as it needs to believe it. But the body keeps score. And somewhere in her, she had known for months. She had just not been ready to know it yet. She eventually slept. Badly, but she slept. In the morning, she shifted back, ate the dried food she'd packed, drank from a stream, and consulted the worn map she kept in the inner pocket of her cloak. The nearest neutral town was Greyridge, a small, unremarkable settlement that sat at the intersection of 3 packed territories and one stretch of human suburban sprawl. It was the kind of place where rejected wolves ended up because no single pack claimed it and no one asked too many questions. It was a 2-day walk. She started walking. The town was exactly as unglamorous as its name suggested. A gas station. A diner with a hand-painted sign that read open in letters that had faded to optimism. A row of small houses with chain-link fences and tired yards. A motel at the far end of the main road, the Ridgeline Inn with 12 units and a vacancy sign that never seemed to come down. Vivian arrived late on the second afternoon, her boots muddy to the ankle, her cloak damp, her body carrying the kind of exhaustion that goes below muscle and into something more fundamental. She stood on the edge of the main road and looked at Greyridge for a long moment. It looked nothing like where she had come from. Good, she thought. Good. She got a room at the motel, paid cash, gave minimal information, was asked minimal questions by the elderly man behind the desk who had clearly seen enough of the world's difficult situations to not need more details about any individual one. His name was Harold. He gave her a key attached to a plastic diamond and pointed her toward Unit 7. She showered for a very long time. Then she sat on the edge of the motel bed in the near dark and let herself cry. Not the quiet, controlled tears of a woman performing dignity. Real crying is the kind that comes from somewhere deeper than sadness. The kind that shakes your shoulders and empties you out slowly and leaves you feeling, afterward, wrung through but lighter. She cried for the bond. She cried for the years she had built in her mind. She cried for the room she had painted blue, the one Andrew had agreed was the right color. She cried for the girl she had been at 19, who had felt the pull of a fated connection and believed, with everything she had, that fate meant something. When she was done, she blew her nose, drank a glass of tap water, and made a list. Vivian had always made lists. It was the thing her mother had taught her: when the world gets too large, make the world smaller. Write down what you can actually do. One thing at a time. Specific, achievable, real. The list had 3 things on it. Find work, find food, find forward. She fell asleep with the list on the nightstand. In the morning, she found work at the diner. Nothing dramatic. Tables, dishes, coffee refills. The owner, a broad-shouldered woman named Donna who wore the same red apron every day and spoke in short, efficient sentences, hired her on a handshake after a 2-minute conversation. Donna had worked with wolves before. She didn't pry. Vivian worked. She was good at working. She learned the rhythms of the diner quickly, the breakfast rush of truck drivers at 6 a.m., the quiet mid-morning that belonged to the retired men who came for coffee and newspapers, the lunch crowd that arrived in a disorganized wave from the light industrial area down the road. She learned which tables needed what, which regulars drank their coffee black, which ones wanted to talk and which ones wanted to be left to their plates. She learned the town the way she had always learned things, by watching carefully and saying less than she knew. She noticed him on the 4th day. He came in at 10 in the morning, after the breakfast rush and before the lunch crowd. Sat in the corner booth with the cracked vinyl that nobody else chose because it faced the wall. He ordered black coffee and something simple from the menu, and then he opened a book and read until he finished his meal. He was not remarkable to look at, which was a strange thing to realize later, when she understood who he was. Light-colored hair, not quite blonde, not quite gray, something cool and deliberate between the 2 cuts simply, nothing styled about it. Medium build, though there was a precision to the way he held himself that her wolf noticed before her conscious mind did. A contained, efficient stillness, like someone who had spent years training themselves not to take up more space than they needed. His clothing was a plain dark jacket, simple shirt. Nothing that announced anything. His eyes, when they lifted from his book as she refilled his coffee, were the color of deep water. Steady. Attentive in a way that didn't feel invasive, more like someone who was genuinely paying attention to the world and filed what they saw carefully away. "Thank you," he said when she set the coffee down. Just those 2 words. She felt her wolf stir, not with recognition, not with anything as legible as attraction, but with a kind of alert quiet, the way an animal goes still, not because it's afraid but because something in the environment has just shifted and needs attention. She refilled his coffee and went back to the counter. His name, she learned from Donna later, was Fred. He had arrived in Graridge about a week before Vivian had. He was renting a place on the edge of town. He paid his rent on time, kept to himself, and was unobtrusive in the way of someone who had made a conscious choice to be. "Quiet one," Donna said, by way of assessment, and went back to her coffee. Vivian thought about those steady, deep-water eyes for longer than she should have that night. Then she thought, "You are 3 days out of a rejection, Vivian. Steady." She made another list. 2 weeks passed. Fred came to the diner every morning. He always took the corner booth. He always ordered black coffee. He always reads. And he always left a tip that was more than 20%, not extravagantly so, but enough that it registered. They exchanged sentences slowly, the way people in a diner do, incremental, low stakes, about nothing important. The weather, the road conditions on the highway, whether Donna's blueberry pie was as good today as it had been yesterday. It was always good. Small conversations that accumulated over days into something that felt, without Vivian being able to identify exactly when it had happened, like a pattern. He never asked about her past. She noticed this. It was not the studied avoidance of a person deliberately not prying. It was more like he genuinely understood that people came to Graridge carrying things they didn't owe explanation for, and that respecting that was simply a matter of basic decency. She started noticing other things. The way he read, not passively, but like someone arguing privately with the text. The slight furrow between his brows. The occasional pause where he'd look up and out the window and seem to be working something through. He read across subjects. History, philosophy, ecology. Once, a thick text on pack law and governance that made Vivian's wolf go very, very still. She didn't say anything about that. She was in her 3rd week in Graridge when the situation that changed everything arrived in the form of a letter. It came to the motel from the Ironwood Pack's legal office, which meant Andrew had paid a solicitor to send it, which meant Andrew was being careful and official and covering himself. The letter was formal and cold and used phrases like unclaimed rogue status and formal severance documentation. It also included, buried in the middle of 2 pages of careful language, a clause she had not expected. Because Vivian had been counted as a resident of Ironwood Pack territory when she came of age, her departure under rejection status meant that by Pack custom she was required to establish a new formal affiliation within 90 days or be classified as an unaffiliated rogue. Unaffiliated rogues were not permitted residency in neutral zones under the Interpack Accords without a sponsor. She stared at the letter for a long time. In the ordinary world, this kind of bureaucratic arrangement might have seemed absurd. But Pack law was old and specific, and it had teeth. Being classified as an unaffiliated rogue meant vulnerability. It meant any dominant wolf could challenge her, that she had no legal standing in disputes, that she could be removed from neutral territory by Pack enforcers on very little grounds. Alone and unsponsored, it was genuinely dangerous. She had 72 days left. She folded the letter and sat with it for 2 nights. On the 3rd morning, Fred was in his usual booth. Vivian brought his coffee, set it down, and then, without entirely planning to slide into the seat across from him, he looked up from his book. Not surprised exactly. More like someone who had been quietly expecting something without being sure when it would arrive. "I have a problem," she said. "And I think you might have one too. And I think, possibly, we could solve both of them together if we're both willing to be honest about our situations." He closed the book. "I'm listening," Fred said. She laid it out plainly, the way she did everything directly, without embellishment, without asking for sympathy. She was a rejected mate. She had a deadline under Pack law. She needed a formal affiliation or a sponsor recognized under the Accords. She was not asking for charity. She was proposing a structure. She paused and looked at him. "You're a wolf," she said. Not a question. Yes, Fred said. Unaffiliated. Here voluntarily, not under rejection. He looked at her with mild curiosity. You noticed. Your wolf sits differently than a rejected wolf does. And you read pack law for pleasure, apparently. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. Not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. What exactly are you proposing, Vivian? She had thought about how to say the next part for 2 nights. A formal mating agreement. On paper. Mutual and practical, it gives me the affiliation status I need and gives you a reason to be here that the accords recognize. It's not permanent if you don't want it to be. I'm not asking you to feel anything about it. I'm asking you to agree to something that helps us both navigate a system that wasn't designed for people in our positions. The silence stretched long enough that she began to think she had badly miscalculated. Then Fred said, "When do you need the paperwork filed?" She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Within 30 days, to be safe." He nodded once. "All right, just that. All right." No questions about her past, no probing into the details of the rejection, no negotiation of terms beyond the basic practical framework. Just a calm, steady agreement from a man who seemed, in all his quiet, to have already worked through whatever calculus he needed to work through. Vivian walked back to the counter feeling both better and considerably more uncertain than she had before sitting down. Her wolf, interestingly, felt neither of those things. Her wolf, for the first time in 3 weeks, felt something approaching calm. They were married on a Tuesday. Nothing ceremonial, a legal filing with the Interpack Accords office in Grayridge. 2 signatures. 1 witness in the form of Donna, who wore her red apron and said, "Well, all right then," in a tone that managed to contain both skepticism and genuine warmth. They shook hands afterward, which struck Vivian as both appropriate and slightly funny, and then she went back to her motel room and Fred went back to his rental, and that was that. But things shifted. Not dramatically, incrementally. They had dinner together twice in the first week, because it seemed like the practical thing to do for a couple that anyone might inspect. It was Fred who suggested they actually talk not about their arrangement, but about things. Books, ideas, the history of pack law and why it had been written the way it had been written and what that said about the people who wrote it. He had opinions which surprised her, because quiet people were often mistaken for people with nothing to say. Fred had a great deal to say. He was simply strategic about when he said it. He was funny, too, in a dry way that arrived without announcement and disappeared before you could be entirely sure it had been there. The first time he made her laugh, the involuntary kind, she put her hand over her mouth in surprise. Like her own body had betrayed her. He looked at her when she laughed. Not with possession, not with hunger, just with a kind of attentive warmth. The look of someone who was glad to have witnessed something genuine. She stopped going back to the motel every night in the 3rd week. Not because of anything said, just because spending time in his rental, with its full kitchen and its shelves of books and its small back window that looked out onto a birch grove, was easier and warmer than the motel unit. She began to notice the strangeness of Fred more clearly in this proximity. His wolf was not an ordinary wolf. She had grown up around wolves her whole life, had understood since childhood how pack energy worked, what dominance felt like in a room. Most wolves broadcast it constantly, even involuntarily, an ambient pressure that the air around them carried. Alpha wolves were worse, almost oppressive in enclosed spaces, their energy filling a room like furniture. Fred broadcast nothing. The absence of it was so complete that it had fooled her at first into thinking he was simply low-ranking. But that wasn't right either. Low-ranking wolves had a different quality. A slight deference, an instinctive softness. Fred had neither of those things. He simply chose, moment to moment, what energy to carry in the room. It was the most precise emotional regulation she had ever encountered in a wolf, and it suggested a level of control that made the back of her neck prickle occasionally. She asked him about it once, carefully. "You're not what you're pretending to be," she said. They were doing dishes. He was washing. She was drying. He didn't look up. "I'm not pretending to be anything," he said. "I'm choosing what to show. Is there a difference?" "Yes." He handed her a rinsed plate. "Pretending involves dishonesty. I haven't lied to you about anything." She turned the plate in her hands. But there are things you haven't told me. Yes, he said again. And then, there are things you haven't told me either. That was fair. She had not told him about the 6 months leading up to the rejection, the slow withdrawal of Andrew's attention, the way she had quietly rearranged her understanding of herself to try to fit into the shape of what he seemed to need. She had not told him about the blue room. She had not told him that the hardest part wasn't the rejection itself but the realization, in the days after, that she had been diminishing herself incrementally for over a year without noticing. She hadn't told him. But somehow, in the weeks of dinners and dishes and evenings on the small back steps looking at the birch trees, a great deal of it had emerged anyway. Not in dramatic confession, just in the natural way things surface when you're in the presence of someone who listens without agenda. Fred listened without agenda. He listened and he remembered and he never weaponized what he heard. That last part, Vivian would think about much later when she understood what he'd been doing by being here at all. He never, not once, used anything she trusted him with as leverage. It was so fundamental to who he was that it barely registered at the time. She was healing. She did not notice it happening, which was, her mother would have told her, precisely how real healing worked. Back in Ironwood, Andrew was making decisions. His alliance with Precious had been officially sealed, a grand ceremony, the kind with imported flowers and a catered reception and a photographer, the kind that was designed more for the optics than the intimacy. The pack had celebrated appropriately. Andrew had given a speech about legacy and strength and the responsibility of leadership. He had not thought about Vivian for 3 weeks after the rejection. Then he started thinking about her. Not sentimentally, he told himself that firmly. Not with regret. Just a residual awareness, the ghost of a severed bond that the body still occasionally reaches for out of habit. He was a rational man. He had made a rational decision. He did not allow himself anything as inefficient as regret. What he allowed himself was information. He asked his lieutenant, a reliable wolf named Roy, to find out where Vivian had gone. Roy found out within a week. Greyridge, the diner, and something else. She had filed a mating agreement with the Interpack Accords office. Andrew stared at that part of Roy's report for a long time. He told himself it didn't matter. But something cold and unpleasant took up residence in his chest that evening, and he found himself, for the first time, wondering whether his certainty had been as solid as he'd believed. The trouble began with the water rights. The Ironwood Pack's eastern border ran alongside the Crestfall River, and the river mattered enormously for the farms, for the livestock, and for the Pack's food supply through winter. The alliance with Precious's family, the Whitmore Pack, had been built partly on the promise that the Whitmores controlled the upstream tributaries and would share access. 6 weeks after the formal mating ceremony, the Whitmores began renegotiating. Andrew sat in his meeting room, the one with the long oak table and the territorial maps on the wall, and listened to Precious's eldest brother Kyle outline, in smooth and reasonable language, a revised access agreement that would cost the Ironwood Pack a significant portion of their eastern grazing land in exchange for maintaining the water rights they had already been promised. Andrew kept his face still. He was good at keeping his face still. This wasn't the arrangement, he said. Arrangements evolve, Kyle said pleasantly. You know how it is, Andrew. Circumstances shift. Our father feels the original terms were somewhat generous. In retrospect. Andrew looked at Precious, who was sitting beside him, her hands folded on the table, her expression entirely composed. She met his gaze and gave a small, graceful shrug. Kyle does have a point, she said. The land exchange is quite reasonable when you look at the acreage calculations. There was a silence in the room that Andrew filed carefully away. He signed nothing that day. He sent them home and called his 3 senior advisors and looked at the maps for a long time. His advisors, who were experienced and loyal and had quietly harbored reservations about the Whitmore alliance from the beginning, chose this moment to finally voice them. Garrett, the eldest, put it plainly. The Whitmores have been running this exact play with 3 other packs in the last 8 years. They form an alliance, wait for the bond to be fully established and the initial leverage gone, and then they begin renegotiating from a position of intimacy. Andrew, you rejected your fated mate for a political alliance. I'm not saying this to be cruel. I'm saying it so that the math is clear. You gave up the one thing you couldn't replace, for a partnership that was always going to do this. Andrew dismissed them. That night, he had his first real argument with Precious. Not about the water rights about the meeting, about the fact that she had sided with her brother in that room rather than with him. She was calm throughout it, which was infuriating. She did not apologize. She said, reasonably and without any visible distress, that her primary loyalty was to her family's long-term interests, as it had always been, and that he had known this about her going in. He had, in fact, known this about her going in. He had simply believed that his own strength would be sufficient counterweight to it. He had believed that the alliance would hold because he was the kind of alpha that alliances held for. He was beginning to understand that he had confused confidence with intelligence. Meanwhile, his pack was restless. A rejected mate was always a wound in a pack's morale, not because the pack necessarily disagreed with the alpha's decision, but because it surfaced uncomfortable questions about what kind of alpha they were following. 3 of his best mid-ranking wolves had filed transfer requests in the month after the ceremony. Roy, his lieutenant, had grown increasingly quiet in meetings, and the pack elders, the ones who had stood at the ceremony with their expressions carefully neutral, had stopped attending his open council sessions. Andrew told himself these were temporary adjustments. Packs recalibrated after transitions. It was normal. But at night, alone in the room where Precious slept with her back to him and her phone in her hand, he thought about Vivian. He thought about the way she had held her chin level in that yard. He thought about the fact that she had filed a mating agreement with someone. He thought about Garrett's words, the one thing you couldn't replace. He told himself it didn't matter. He told himself that less convincingly each time. Back in Grayridge, Vivian was having a completely different kind of night. Fred had made dinner something complicated with herbs from the small garden he'd planted along the back fence, served with bread from the local bakery that was still warm. They ate at the small kitchen table with the window open to the birch grove. She had brought home a book she thought he'd like, a history of interpack diplomacy that she'd found at a second-hand stall in the weekend market, and he had picked it up and read the first page standing at the counter, and then said, "Where did you find this?" with such genuine delight that she'd laughed. After dinner, in the quietness of the evening, she had looked at him across the table and felt something move in her chest, not the snap and sear of a fated bond, not the urgent, predetermined pull of mate recognition, but something slower and more deliberately chosen. A warmth that had been built, conversation by conversation, honesty by honesty, over weeks of genuinely knowing a person. She had not expected to be capable of this yet. She sat with it for a while without saying anything about it. That seemed like the right approach for now. Fred was looking at the birch trees through the window. His expression was the quiet one, the one she had learned to read as him thinking about something with some depth to it. "What?" she asked. He turned to look at her. Steady. Attentive. "I'm going to tell you something. Not tonight, soon. There's something you need to know about me that I should have told you earlier." Her stomach tightened slightly. "Is it bad?" "No," he said. "It's just complicated. And I wanted to wait until you were ready to hear something complicated." She looked at him for a moment. "Okay," she said. She trusted that. The trust itself surprised her. She filed it away next to the warmth from earlier, and looked back out at the birch trees, and let the evening be what it was. He told her on a Saturday morning in October, when the birch grove behind the house had gone gold and the air carried the first real bite of the coming winter. They were sitting on the back steps with coffee, and he set his mug down, turned to face her and said, "Frederick Hale." She looked at him. "I know your name." "Not that name," he said. "That name." She went still. The Hale bloodline was not a history you needed a book to know. It was taught in packs the same way you taught borders and treaties as a foundational fact of the world. The Hale line was the oldest continuous high alpha lineage in the Northern Territories. 3 centuries of governance. Pack law, as it was currently written, had been substantially shaped by the Hale Accords of the early 20th century. The last confirmed Hale alpha had disappeared from public record about 15 years ago, amid a dispute so large and so politically dangerous that most packs referred to it obliquely and most pack historians treated it as a case study in what happened when the accumulation of power became self-defeating. Everyone in the wolf world knew the name Hale. Nobody knew where he was. Vivian sat with this information for a very long moment. "You've been living in a 12-unit motel town," she said finally. "Yes. Reading pack law for fun. I wrote some of it. I find reading what you wrote calming." She pressed her lips together. "Not amusement or not only amusement. Why are you here? Why Graridge?" He picked up his coffee again. "I looked at the gold trees. Because I needed to be somewhere I wasn't known. I had a period of my life where I made decisions based on what my lineage demanded of me and not on what was actually right. The consequences were significant. I spent years working through what that meant and what I owed for it. I came to Graridge because it was neutral, because it was quiet, and because I had no intention of being anyone important for a while. And then I sat down across from you in a diner. And then you sat down across from me in a diner," he agreed. She was quiet for a long moment. "Does this change our arrangement?" Fred turned to look at her, then really look at her, with all that deep-water steadiness fully present. "Only if you want it to. I'm not the Hale bloodline to you, Vivian. I'm the person who makes you coffee and argues with you about whether Graridge has the best pie in neutral territory." He paused. "For the record, it does." She almost smiled. "I know it does. I work there. My point is that I'm still the same person I was yesterday. What I told you is a fact about my history. It doesn't change what this has become unless you decide it does." Vivian looked at her coffee. She thought about the warmth she had felt 2 weeks ago at the kitchen table. She thought about a woman she had been before the rejection, one who had made herself smaller to fit a space that was never going to be hers anyway. She thought about the list on the motel nightstand that first night. Find work, find food, find forward. She had found forward. She hadn't expected it to look like this, but she had learned this year to stop being surprised by the shape of grace. "Tell me the rest," she said. "About what happened, what you're actually doing here." He told her. Took most of the morning. He told her about the Hale Accord dispute, about the political machinery that had built up around his lineage over decades, about the moment 15 years ago when he had understood that the structure around him had become corrupted by ambition, not his own, primarily, but the ambition of the people who had spent years positioning themselves to control the Hale name. He told her about the decision to step back, to disappear from the system, to spend a decade relearning what it meant to make decisions from principle rather than from power. He told her he had been planning to return. He had been building, quietly and carefully, a framework for resuming authority under the Hale Accords, not to reassert dominance, but to correct the specific injustices his absence had allowed to fester. He had a network of allies, a legal strategy, and a timeline. Graridge had a final period of preparation, a last intentional chapter of being nobody before the world knew his name again. And then an exhausted woman with a steady chin had sat down across from him with a practical problem and an uncommonly clear mind, and the calculus of his timeline had quietly shifted. "I wasn't looking for this," he said. "Not apologetically, just honestly." "Neither was I," Vivian said. "That's usually when the important things happen." He looked at her. She looked back. What passed between them in that look was not the predetermined certainty of a fated bond. It was something that required no fate to justify it, something that had been built, piece by piece, from honesty and attention and the willingness to be fully present with another person. It was, in the best and most essential meaning of the word, a choice. That evening, when the gold light from the birch grove came through the kitchen window and fell across the table where they were eating dinner, Vivian reached across and took his hand. He turned his hand over and held hers. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. The summons from the Interpac Council arrived in November. It was not addressed to Vivian. It was addressed to Frederick Hale formally, bearing the seal of the Northern Council, requesting his presence at a governance hearing in 3 weeks' time to address a sustained pattern of violations by the Whitmore Pack across 4 neutral territories. Vivian read it over his shoulder at the kitchen table. "Your network?" she asked. 3 years of very careful documentation," he said. She sat down across from him. "Andrew's pack is one of the affected territories." "Yes. So he'll be there." "Almost certainly." She was quiet. He watched her. "Do you want to go?" he asked. She thought about it really, without the flinch she might have felt 3 months ago at the idea of walking into a room where Andrew was. She assessed herself honestly, the way she had been learning to do. Was it fear? No. Was it the desire for revenge? She checked for that too, genuinely. No. It was quieter than either of those things. It was the simple sense that something had been left incomplete, and that completion, not vengeance, just honest completion, was available. Yes, she said. They arrived at the Northern Council Hall on a gray November morning that smelled of cold stone and old authority. The hall was a wide, high-ceilinged building in the middle of the oldest neutral city in the Northern Territories. All stone floors and high windows, and the particular formality of a place where power had been negotiated for a very long time. Delegates from 14 packs were already in the main gallery. The Whitmore pack had a full contingent, with Precious's father seated at the center, looking exactly like a man who had been caught doing something he had been doing for years and was very surprised that anyone had finally noticed. Vivian entered the hall with Fred and felt the room change. Not with her presence. The contained, deliberate stillness that Fred carried had always been the absence of pressure. He released it the moment they crossed the threshold, and the effect was immediate and unmistakable. Every wolf in the room felt it. Heads turned. The room's ambient energy rearranged itself the way a river rearranges around a stone, instinctively, without question, orienting toward the source. The whisper moved through the gallery in under 30 seconds. Hail. Vivian watched it happen and felt something that was not pride but was, in the same neighborhood, the deep, bone-level satisfaction of standing beside a person who was exactly what they appeared to be. Andrew was in the third row. She saw him see her. The shock crossed his face before he could contain it, the involuntary wide eye of a man who had filed an experience away as finished and encountered it walking into a room on its own terms. She saw him take her in. The way she stood, the quality of her stillness, the woman beside Frederick Hale who was not diminished, not broken, not the ghost of a rejected mate but something altogether more present and complete. She met his gaze. She did not look away first. She did not need to. The hearing lasted 6 hours. Fred presented the documentation with 3 years of evidence, testimony from affected packs, a legal analysis of Whitmore violations that was so thorough and so precisely constructed that the council had almost nothing to deliberate. By the 4th hour, Precious's father had stopped pretending to look calm. By the 5th, 2 of the Whitmore delegates had left the table. Andrew gave testimony about the water rights renegotiation. He was composed, factual, and Vivian noticed did not look at Precious once while he spoke. The council's ruling was issued the following morning. The Whitmore pack was found to have violated the inter-pack accords across 6 counts. Their territorial claims in the neutral zones were revoked. Their alliance agreements, including the one with the Ironwood pack, were declared void under the corruption clause, which meant Andrew's pack was released from the arrangement entirely. It also meant that Andrew had lost the alliance, the water rights agreement, and the political foundation he had traded his mate's bond to acquire. All of it, in one ruling. Vivian was in the corridor outside the main hall when Andrew found her. He came around the corner and stopped when he saw her, and for a moment, just a moment, the composed surface of him was entirely gone. What was there instead was something much more raw. The face of a man who had spent months running numbers that kept coming out wrong. "Vivian," he said. "Andrew," she said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her. She watched him try to find the opening for whatever he had come to say. She had some idea of what it was. She was not naive about what the loss of the Whitmore alliance meant for him, about how the math looked from where he was standing. She waited, with patience she would not have had 3 months ago, for him to say it. "I made a mistake," he said. She had thought, once, that those words from Andrew would feel like something enormously significant. Like a reversal, like vindication, like the universe resetting its mistake. Standing in that stone corridor with her hands quiet at her sides, she found that it felt much smaller than she had imagined. Not because it didn't matter. It mattered. Acknowledgement matters. But she had done so much internal work, had rebuilt herself so thoroughly from the ground up, that the part of her that would have needed this desperately, urgently was no longer the part of her that was running things. "I know," she said. "I hope you learn from it." He looked at her. Something flickered across his face, not hope, not quite, but the edge of wanting to ask something. She saw it coming. "Don't," she said, gently, not unkindly. "Don't ask me that. It's not the right question, and even if it were, you already know the answer. He was quiet. She let the silence do what silence does. When it's held long enough, it tells the truth. Take care of your pack, she said. That's the job. Do it better than you did before. Lean on Garrett. Stop performing and start leading. She turned to go. Vivian. She paused but didn't turn. He's lucky, Andrew said. His voice was stripped of performance. Just the plain, unvarnished admission of it. She thought about Fred, about the birch trees and the coffee and the 6 hours of meticulous, principled work in that council hall, about a man who had disappeared from the world for 15 years to learn the difference between power and wisdom, and had come back and made her dinner. No, she said. We're lucky. There's a difference. She walked back to the hall. She did not look back. 3 months after the Northern Council hearing, Frederick Hale formally resumed his role under the Hale Accords, not as a territorial alpha commanding a single pack, but as a high arbitrator, the role the Hale lineage had originally been established to serve. Independent, accountable to the council as a whole, existing outside any single pack's political interests. It meant they didn't live in Grayridge anymore. They chose a house in the neutral city near the council hall. An old stone building with an overgrown garden and a kitchen that needed completely new plumbing and more rooms than 2 people needed. Fred said he'd wanted the garden for years. Vivian said she'd handle the kitchen, which she did, systematically and with considerable satisfaction over the course of a very cold February. She did not go back to being anyone's anything. She had built, in the years that followed, a role that had not existed in precisely that form before. A liaison office for unaffiliated and rejected wolves navigating the pack legal system, working out of the council hall, staffed by herself and 3 others she had recruited from exactly the kind of situation she had once been in herself. The work was unglamorous and essential, and she was extraordinarily good at it. She and Fred argued about pack law regularly and with great enthusiasm. He almost always had to concede at least one point, which he did with the dry, unhurried grace that was entirely his own. She had long since stopped being surprised by how funny he was. She had simply made room for it, the way you make room for something that belongs. Andrew rebuilt. It took time and cost him more than he had expected and required, as Vivian had suggested, the complete abandonment of performance in favor of actual leadership. Garrett became his closest advisor. The pack stabilized. He never remarried, not quickly at any rate, and not for the wrong reasons. He and Vivian were not friends, but they were eventually, years later, in the measured way of people who have navigated something difficult without bitterness, able to be in the same room and speak plainly to each other. That was enough. That was actually more than enough. Precious returned to her family's territory and, stripped of the political architecture that had defined her, had to reckon with herself in ways she had spent her whole life avoiding. Whether she did it successfully is a story for another time. But she began. Donna kept the diner open. The blueberry pie remained excellent. On the first anniversary of the day, Vivian had sat down across from Fred in the corner booth. He gave her the book she had found at the second-hand stall, the Interpack Diplomacy History she had brought home as a gift. He had filled the margins with notes, hundreds of them, in his careful handwriting, observations, arguments, questions, a few small drawings in the corners that were completely inexplicable and which made her laugh every time she found a new one. On the inside cover, he had written one thing: for Vivian, who sat down across from me. The best decision I didn't make was for both of us. She kept the book on the nightstand. She always would. A word before we go. This story is, at its core, about 2 things that we don't talk about enough. The first is this: rejection, whether in a relationship, a friendship, a job, or a family, is a real and physiological experience. It is not a weakness to grieve for it. The research on social rejection consistently shows that the brain processes it in ways that overlap with physical pain. The response is real. The healing takes time. And the first step in that healing is not moving on, it is allowing yourself to actually feel the loss without punishing yourself for it. The second is this: love that is chosen, built conversation by conversation, honesty by honesty, through the deliberate decision to be present with another person, is not a lesser thing than love that arrives with dramatic certainty. It is, in many ways, a braver and more durable thing. It requires more of you, and it gives back more in kind. Vivian did not get what she expected. She got something better, A life she actually built with a person who actually saw her, doing work that actually mattered. Andrew did not get what he planned for. He got a lesson that most of us need eventually. That strength built on the diminishment of others is not strength at all. It is a performance, and performances always end. Fred, for his part, spent 15 years learning the difference between power and wisdom, between authority you inherit and authority you earn through accountability. That lesson is worth 15 years. It is worth any number of years. What will you do with yours? Hey, quick question. How are you feeling right now? If Vivian's journey moved something in you, if you felt her pain, her rebuilding, her choosing, then you know what kind of story this is. It's the kind that deserves to keep going. So here is what I need from you, and I mean this genuinely. Hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and leave a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from. I will personally say hello to as many of you as I can, because I want to know how far this story has traveled, how many cities, how many countries, and how many people it has found. You are not just a viewer. You are the reason stories like this exist. Thank you for being here. From the very bottom of my heart, thank you. Now scroll down and tell me where you're watching from. I'll be reading every single one. Some stories are about revenge. This one wasn't. This was a story about what happens after the worst moment. About the woman who walks away from a burning house and, instead of standing in the ashes watching it, keeps walking until she finds herself somewhere she hadn't planned, with someone she hadn't expected, building something she hadn't dared to want. Andrew didn't lose Vivian the night he rejected her. He lost her the year before that. Slowly, in every moment he chose performance over presence. Every moment he chose what looked like strength over what actually required it. Vivian didn't find herself the night she left. She found herself in the diner, in the conversation, in the dishes, in the honesty, in the daily, ongoing, deliberate choice to be exactly who she was with someone who made space for all of it. Fred didn't save her. She saved herself. He just had the intelligence to get out of her way while she did it, and the integrity to be worth walking toward when she was ready. In the end, love was not forced, power was not borrowed, and respect was earned. Vivian didn't just survive. She won. And so can you. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you just to know how far our story is going.